Hey, welcome back to another dispatch from Holly McKay. We're going to Pakistan today, and in particular, we're going to revisit the plight of Dr. Shakil Afriidi, who is, stock. Tell us about this, Holly.
So this is an issue that I have been really following, I guess, now for more than a decade. If we remind ourselves back to the very infamous Bin Laden raid in 2011, of course, Bin Laden was found by the CIA in a compound in Abbottabad in Pakistan, which was right by, it's sort of their equivalent to their West Point, right by this big military place. So that in itself was hugely controversial. But in order to, I guess, identify that it really was Osama bin Laden in this compound, the CIA had quite an extensive plot. And part of that plot was that they essentially hired, not that he knew who the client was, but a doctor, a surgeon in the area by the name of Dr. Shakil Afriidi was essentially hired to give swabs and DNA to collect it from the compound, and that became sort of a major part of being able to identify Osama bin Laden. Long story short, once the capture and kill happened, and it was this sort of lauded moment for the Obama administration, and details of the plot were exposed. However, Dr. Shakil Afriidi was not out of the country. And of course, it took, I think, less than 21 days for the ISI, which is the Pakistani intelligence, to figure out who this surgeon that had worked with the Americans was. And mind you, under what his lawyer tells me, that he certainly was not aware, really, that he was working for the agency or who the client was. And unfortunately, he was rolled up, and ever since then, he's been sentenced in these kangaroo courts. He's in a Peshawar jail. Initially, he was sentenced to more than 30 years in prison. Under appeal, it got reduced to, I believe, 23. And mind you, he's already been in the prison now for 11, 12 years, and efforts to get him out have really just fallen on deaf ears. It seems that he has been really forgotten by the United States government, despite this very prolific role that he played. And I just think it's really important to sort of continue to follow up. And I've maintained a relationship with his lawyer, who's also his cousin, and Kumar, and we constantly sort of go back and forth, and he gives me updates when possible on Dr. Afriidi's condition. And it sounds like it's a really horrible jail that he's in, and he's wasting away and suffering from a lot of health problems.
Yeah. Well, and it's been a while now. I mean, that in the world of the war on terror, that was quite a long time ago. So many things have happened since then. But the question that always comes up for me, and I'm sure you looked into this, is that it was kind of a black eye for the Pakistanis that this happened on their watch, and so close to a place that they considered to be, something that they had well under control. And
Yeah,
to what extent does that at this point play into the fact that the it's not just the United States that may have forgotten, but it could be that the Pakistanis have never forgotten the black eye.
well, it's sort of you're in a rock and a hard place, really, for Pakistan. You're either say you didn't know bin Laden was there, then you are essentially incompetent because your biggest military university is right down the road. Or you say that you knew he was there, and then that's complete sort of violation of the trust with the United States, who is paying you foreign assistance to fight terrorism, whilst the most wanted man in the world is living there. So there isn't too many great sort of options for the Pakistanis to have been able to spin that. Of course, it was a hugely embarrassing moment for them, and it was clear that Dr. Afriidi was sort of an easy scapegoat for them to kind of go after. Mind you, he was never actually charged with sort of any espionage or for being a traitor, which is what you think he was going to be charged for. But Pakistan was smart in that if those sorts of charges would have rendered him into a federal court system, whereas sort of being able to instigate local charges sort of means that he is, and these local charges are things like being an operative for a local terrorist organization called LET, which honestly is all quite absurd. But in being able to do that, that means that he sort of goes through the tribal court system, which is certainly, quote unquote, a kangaroo court system, and it's not open to the public. And so it's sort of a lot easier to keep him behind bars than sort of if you have to have go through the typical federal court system. So there is a method in that. And, you know, and it's been something I think over the years that has just kind of faded away. And I think Pakistan also runs the risk of, from their point of view, you know, if Afriidi was to be released, would that ignite sort of a national uproar? Would they be dealing with riots in the street? Would they be dealing with, you know, huge security problems that you know, would be much worse for them? So they certainly have those considerations as well. So from their view, it's really just easier to kind of let him sit in this jail and essentially kind of fade away, if you will. And to me, I see that as being, you know, it's also sad from the US point of view. I think definitely over the course of the last decade, really the statements that come out of the State Department are essentially the same, that he's unjustly imprisoned, that they constantly raise this issue at the highest levels. But mind you, these statements have been the same statements over the course of a decade, and they haven't really changed, and there is no progress that seems to be made on this case. When I talk to his lawyer, you know, he says that, you know, he isn't aware of any developments, and he's constantly, you know, trying to put it back on the map and to not let the US forget that happened. So it's really a sad situation. His family as well, I mean, they're under a lot of threat. They have to change location every few weeks. They can't work. I mean, he was obviously the breadwinner. Now they're very much poverty stricken. They're relying on distant relatives sort of to give them money, but it's sort of they're being ostracized and sort of paying the price as well. So there is huge ramifications. And then I do think it's also important to acknowledge that the ramifications in terms of vaccines have been huge in Pakistan as well. It's one of the few places in the world where polio actually has made a comeback. And that is in large part because of that particular incident that made people very hesitant and frightened to get vaccines. And so you had a lot of children that were dying of these diseases that were once eradicated. And you also had healthcare workers that were being threatened and even killed when they were trying to do these vaccine rounds. So huge ramifications from many different perspectives. And I believe in recent years, the agency has actually banned using sort of vaccines as one of its covers. So you can sort of see the fallout from so many different directions.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting fallout to point out, and that so this sleight of hand that was used by the U.S. intelligence apparatus has poisoned the water for legitimate medical and vaccination programs in the area, and that may be the larger damage in the long run that has occurred. In the US, aside from lip service, which is clearly lip service meant to accomplish nothing, hasn't gone to any extent to try to get this thing out of the regional court into some sort of situation where some resolution could be gotten to, or are both governments at this point just content to let this guy rot?
I don't doubt that in the past that it certainly was an issue that was raised, but it was obviously an issue that they received sort of no headway on, that Pakistan wasn't willing to budge on. And so I think, you know, particularly in the Biden administration, I'm not sure how much of an issue it really is anymore. It was one thing, if we remember, that Trump really bragged about when he was campaigning in 2016, that he would be able to get Afriidi out in a minute. Of course, that didn't happen. And even several years ago, when I sort of tried to chase some officials at the White House to kind of get a little bit more clarity and comment on why that hadn't happened, my emails were initially sort of followed up, and then they fell on deaf ears after that. So Trump wasn't even able to kind of establish that. So it's clear that this is an issue for Pakistan that is something they're holding extremely close and are certainly not willing to budge on. And you know, to me, that is it's a sad reflection, because I think if the US is to continue to go about these important missions, they need to have good assets. They need to have good allies. And when people look at incidences like this, I think my understanding from people in the Pentagon at the time was that they did offer Afriidi sort of an escape before the plot became public. But in these particular cultures, it's not just a matter of, you know, escaping with your wife or two children. You're looking at people that feel the need to bring their entire extended family that they often live with. So in Afriidi's case, he was apparently wanted to bring, you know, 20 or so people. That was not a doable thing. So I think he sort of made the calculation to stay in Pakistan, not really thinking that his cargo would be blown, but quite quickly, sort of doing this glory lap, Leon Panetta, who was running the CIA at the time, kind of came out and exposed these sort of intricate details, which the US sort of now sort of says is a mistake. And so it was fairly easy for the Pakistani authorities to sort of narrow in on Afriidi at that point. So a lot of mishaps along the way, that is for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So last question, you had mentioned that, you know, the possibility that if the Pakistanis on their own did let this guy out, that one of their fears might be that it could have local cultural implications. Is that Pakistani pride, or is there some
That's
real
society.
fear?
Honestly, if you look at so many situations, I remember in the last few years, Asia Bibi, there was a Christian woman who was accused of blasphemy. She was in jail, really wrongly, sort of detained for a long time. Eventually, when she was able to be released, there were huge riots, and you know, she had to sort of get her out under the radar to get to the West, and it was quite a big deal. And I think if that was sort of such a large scale problem, then you know, you're looking at a very sort of conservative component of society. And if you know, if Afriidi wants to be released, that is certainly a legitimate concern.
Okay, so for the Pakistanis, it could be more of a lesser of two evils choice, and unfortunately for Dr. Afriidi, he's on the losing end of that one at the moment. Wow. Well, I mean, you know, I'm sure this thing isn't over yet, and I'm sure that you are going to continue to follow up on this as time goes on and keep the world appraised of these dangling things that the world would like to forget but should not. So thank you, Holly, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.